Okay, hello everyone, and welcome teachers, students, and many EF staffers. We are so glad you've decided to join us virtually for this exciting event today with our very special guest, Hoshonda Sanders, who is with us today through our relationship with the School of the New York Times. And I will tell you a bit more about her in just a minute. My name is Darby Jones, and I oversee educational partnerships for EF Explore America. And I am joined by my colleague, Sarah Shaban, who oversees loyalty and works closely with teachers from around the country. Quick reminder, although we can't see the rest of you, please submit any questions you might have into that Q&A feature during our time together. And Sarah will be keeping an eye on that in case we have time to go through some of those questions throughout, and of course at the end as well. So on to our esteemed guests. Hoshonda Sanders' work has appeared in the New York Times, Time Magazine, Oxford American Magazine, and many other publications. Her first children's book in a series, I Can Write the World, was published in 2019. She has also written the journalism textbook, How Racism and Sexism Killed Traditional Media, Why the Future of Journalism Depends on Women and People of Color, and the memoir, The Beautiful Darkness, a Handbook for Orphans. She has been the recipient of writing residencies, fellowships, and awards from the Martha's Vineyard Institute of Creative Writing, Lambda Literary, Bronx Council on the Arts, Hedgebrook, VONA, and the Key West Literary Seminars. All of this, of course, is beyond impressive. So, Hoshonda, thank you so much for being here, and I will now turn this over to you.
Thank you so much, Darby. So exciting to be here. Thank you so much for having me. I'm excited to share my workshop presentation with you. And so with that, we will get started. You've already heard a lot about me, so I don't know how much more you need to hear, but I will share that in addition to those things, the reason I got interested in journalism is because I was a Hearst Newspapers Fellow about 20 years ago. And over the course of 2 years, I worked at 4 different newspapers that were under the Hearst umbrella in different sized markets. And so I worked first at the Houston Chronicle and then the Beaumont Enterprise, which is a tiny, tiny paper in East Texas. And then I worked at the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and the San Francisco Chronicle. I later worked at the Austin American Statesman, which I'll talk a little bit more about in the course of the workshop. And since then, my work has appeared in some of the publications that Darby mentioned, which is incredible to me. And so I mention that because I discussed journalism from the perspective of someone who never actually intended to become a reporter. I didn't realize that it was something that was available to me as a Black girl growing up in the Bronx, someone who came from a sort of working class and poor background. But I did come to love the profession and its ability to illuminate the experiences of people who are almost never heard from their perspectives. It didn't really occur to me when I was younger that I didn't really see models for what it would look like to tell my own story. And so newspapers became a way of seeing what difference that actually makes in the course of people's lives. So I worked with, obviously in a number of different newsrooms and many different editors over the course of my life. And so I think it's always important when you're sharing experiences that you're talking not just from lived experience, but also from whatever research that you've done. So that's sort of where I'm coming from with this presentation and what I'll be sharing with you. I've also been working in strategic communications now and outside of newsrooms for almost a decade, and that's given me kind of a slightly different perspective as well. I can sort of see things from the outside in, so to speak. But what I most want you to remember and take away from this is super important. You can't create what you cannot see. It's a really simple idea, but it's one that can be challenging. Especially when we talk about a word that's as coded and as weighty as diversity. And so put another way, to be a great journalist is to be a great witness to history. So I just want you to keep those things in the back of your mind as we begin to talk about some of these other aspects of diversity and what it means. The easiest way to become a good witness to history, I think, is to learn to see beyond our biases and our filters, and to see beyond our own experiences, to see the experiences of others. That's why I love this first slide, and just seeing the way that she's looking at and kind of peering into the experiences of other people. So the most important aspect of beginning to look at dimensions of diversity in journalism is actually borrowing from mindfulness practice. I've been a meditator on and off for about 15 years or so. There have been more off times than on most of the time. But one of the great parts of mindfulness practice is learning to actually see what is, not what you think is there, not what you imagine is there, but really, what can I see? What is actually in front of me? And perspective is a huge aspect of beginning to see, and then through seeing, beginning to empathize and understand. So I wanted to start by giving you some historical context for the discussion of diversity, because it's a word, like I said, that comes up a lot, and it means different things to different people. Want to talk about what the meaning of diversity is now, dimensions of diversity to be looking out for, how you can look out for them, and some other considerations that digital media brings up for all of us to sort out. But before I get into the next slide, I do want to encourage you to ask questions as I go along. Please don't feel like you have to wait until the end. If there's something that I'm talking about that you have a question about right now, then feel free. I can pause and address it while we go. So this is a picture from the riots, uprisings of the summer of 1967. So before the 1960s in the US, there was no talk of diversity or anything like it. It was often called mass media, meaning newspapers, television, radio, and magazines. But for some time now, it's been referred to as legacy media. Excuse me one second.
You just have to love animals in the background. So little break, everyone. Hang tight.
I'm so sorry about that. Just got a delivery, of course, while I'm in the middle of a presentation. So great. Thank you for your patience. So I'll start again. So before the 1960s in the US, there was no talk of diversity or anything like diversity in what's often called mass media, which are newspapers, television, radio, magazines. And for some time now, I think that whole group of outlets has been called legacy media or old media or traditional media. And this is in contrast, of course, to social media, which is plural, or digital media, which is sometimes called new media. And so the variety of media in and of itself, of course, is another way to think about diversity and the diversity of experiences that we have access to. You may have heard of pioneering journalists like Ida B. Wells in the Chicago area, who in 1895 compiled the Red Record by keeping track of lynchings of mostly Black men, but there were some Black women actually who were also lynched, and the true reasons for them. Charlotta Bass in California reporting for the Eagle on Black pastors who actually helped the Ku Klux Klan, for example. Here in New York, the newspaper, the Amsterdam News, is a part of the long tradition of Black newspapers that have long reported in-depth, nuanced stories on the Black community at times when sometimes larger, more prominent white institutions did not. Modern diversity in journalism, though, began approximately 50 years ago, right around when this picture was taken. This events like the one that you see here in the surrounding context of them led to something called the Report on the National Advisory Commission for Civil Disorders, or the Kerner Commission for short, which was published in 1968. Then President Lyndon Johnson called on the 11-member bipartisan group led by Illinois Governor Otto Kerner to look at what was the cause of what were described back then as civil disorders. It should be noted, since we're talking about diversity in journalism, that the report itself, or the commission itself, excuse me, was made up of about 10 men, mostly white. The sole Black man was Roy Wilkins, who was then the president of the NAACP. And there was one woman who was a commerce commissioner from Kentucky, Catherine Peden. So there have been these riots in 23 cities starting in the summer of 1967. And they were essentially large groups of frustrated and disenfranchised Black people in places like Detroit and Newark. All of these riots happened over a 2-week period. There were more than 80 people who died, others were injured, businesses were destroyed, and the president wanted answers on what happened and how to prevent it from happening again. Among the findings of the Kerner Commission report were a few observations based on interviews and research. And the first was, our nation is moving toward two societies, one Black and one white, separate and unequal. Discrimination and segregation threaten the future of every American. Most relevant for our purposes in this workshop is the finding from the report that media had exaggerated claims of damages from the riots in major cities, that they distorted and left out important context about what were then called Negro ghettos, which were essentially, established and perpetrated by the government in some ways when writing about the violence that segregation had prompted. And the commission was the first governmental body in the US to assert that the media report and write from a white man's standpoint. And this, of course, flies in the face of what we would hope for 50 plus years after the commission report was written, but alas, we still have newsrooms that are the majority white, that are made up of journalists who are at least middle class, but more often from upper middle class and elite families. In other words, when I started working as a reporter, I think I made about $20,000 a year before taxes. I was in some smaller markets, but it's not a lot of money. And in order to have sort of the support that you need to become a journalist, you do sort of need to be able to afford to work in a place like New York or LA on a low salary, where the rent is disproportionately high compared to other places. So kind of as a result of some of the sort of embedded biases and disparities in newsrooms, reporters still tend to be white and male, editors and publishers especially so. It's rare to encounter in mainstream media reporters with disabilities who don't have aspirations or connections to legacy media in coastal or expensive cities, or reporters who acknowledge their gender privilege, their pronouns, or ageism, for example. Some dimensions of diversity we don't often talk about. So these are some of the dimensions of diversity I want us to be considering or to think about how to look for. When I'm looking for diversity in media coverage, there are some of the dimensions of diversity that I think about. I want to know how a subject is treated based on any of these things or all of them, and whether the reporter sees them in the course of the conversation or profile or news story by understanding how these identities shape that particular person or the community that they come from. I'm also always interested, excuse me, in how those stories are balanced out by other voices, including social media, which I'll get to, and what exactly makes it count as a diverse story when it's published. This photo, by the way, is one that was taken of Edward Crawford in Ferguson, Missouri in 2014. It's easy to look at it and see defiance or outrage or read other things into the meaning of the photo. it circulated really quickly and prominently on social media, but not so much in print media, which I find interesting because it became kind of an emblematic picture in some ways of what happened in Ferguson. Um, but the context was that police had thrown this tear gas canister in his hand, and Mr. Crawford was captured by a reporter from the St. Louis Dispatch, or photographer Robert Cohen, who caught him actually throwing the canister back to the police to keep them out of the way of children, is what he told Cohen. And so that was only elevated actually in a few news stories when he was discovered dead. It was a suspicious death in his car about 3 years later in 2017. But I always think about this picture for some reason. I think because it goes back to what I was talking about earlier in terms of how what you see and how you think about what you see helps you frame history, helps you become a reliable witness to history. And so when I'm talking about analyzing stories for diversity dimensions, I am thinking about race and ethnicity, of course. Those are the first, I think, dimensions that come up and the ones that are most common for us to be looking for. But I also think about gender and how gender or lack thereof impacts how someone views the world, how the world interacts with them. Geography, of course, has become more of a diversity dimension for us to be looking out for, especially, I think, post, the election of President Trump in 2016, where there was a great deal of conversation about flyover states and just how polarized we are regionally and geographically. Class is another sort of I would say underestimated and underreported story. How the amount of money your family has, the amount of money you will or will not inherit impacts the trajectory of your life, right? We have a really, I think, a fondness in our country for meritocracy as pretty much the way that you get to the American dream, but it has to also be subsidized in some way. Age, of course, is another aspect of diversity that rarely gets discussed. And so as a result, we often see stories that reinforce stereotypes about age and what is possible depending on how old you are. And ability. I will not profess, I would say, in terms of the dimensions of diversity where I may have the biggest weakness, it is as it relates to differently abled people and the community around disability and how to talk about it. There are some other factors, of course, that count as diversity too. Political affiliation is one of them, kind of a hot topic, leave that alone. And religious identity, sexual orientation also come, I think, under that umbrella. And there are probably many more that I'm forgetting. And it's been interesting to think about these things in the context of my experience as a younger reporter, speaking of age. I probably have already aged myself, dated myself, but it's okay. I was thinking recently about being a young reporter about 10 years ago. Can't believe it's been that long. When Tea Party rallies descended on the Austin State Capitol. And I was often, I was going to graduate school while I was working at the Austin American Statesman. And so I worked a weird shift from Tuesdays to Saturdays. And on Saturday, I always had to cover festivals or like whatever interesting thing was happening that day. And it just so happened that all the rallies happened on Saturday. So I was the lucky person in the newsroom who got to go, but I was often the sole Black woman reporter who also happened to be relatively young compared to the people I was covering, in these crowds of really fired up, angry white men who were yelling and had flags and pictures of Obama as Joker. And it was kind of intense. And I was kind of scared, but I also at that point had already written about serial killers and murder and mayhem, along with some fluffy features and kids at the circus. So I wasn't too worried. I'd already done a lot of kind of cutting edge reporting, I guess you could call it. But a lot of the attendees at these rallies considered me a threat. One told me just off the bat. I mean, sometimes I would try to hide my notebook, which is like not possible if you're actually trying to take notes. But I was trying to like keep it under wraps a little bit. And one guy caught me actually like taking note of what I was seeing, and he said, he knew that I was for Obama just based on what I look like, and he didn't expect me to be objective about them. And while he guessed appropriately and accurately, I didn't reinforce what he believed to be true just based on what I looked like. I reminded him that my job as a reporter was to be a witness to what was unfolding, and I wasn't judging him or anyone else around me for being different from me or having different beliefs. I didn't agree with anything that was happening around me, but that wasn't my job. My job was to report how many people I thought were there, what they said, what their perspective was, and to put it in the paper. And so I said to him, if you think, look, we live in a small place. I mean, Austin is, I call it a small town that, is one day will be a big city, right? It has increasingly become bigger, but, the slogan there is keep Austin weird, right? Like people are really like live and let live for the most part, but there's also it's still Texas, right? So there's like a pretty conservative streak. And also, most people still read the paper. They read the local paper. They want to know, what you thought about that festival or that rally. So, I said, just read it, and my email and my phone number will be at the bottom. And if you think I did you wrong, then just, email me and complain to my bosses. It just takes a lot of confidence to tell people to rat on you if they think that you're awful. But I felt pretty confident that I could do justice to their beliefs without trashing them. Just because I didn't personally agree with them didn't mean that what they were doing was insignificant. And so the next day the story ran. He surprised me by emailing me, and it wasn't like, trolly or crazy. It was just, he thought I did a fair news. I did a fair thing, being part of the fake news media. I did fine, I was like, awesome. That's the most you can hope for, honestly. And I didn't change anything. I didn't change his mind. I didn't, bring him over to my way of thinking or anything like that. But I did get to see him. I think I did get him to see something from a different point of view, which is, really the work of journalism. I'm going to pause for a second because I don't know if there have been any questions. No, we're good.
Actually, there are a couple questions. I want to ask them all right now, but you're talking a lot about your experience as you approach the reporting on these stories and being objective. And I'm just curious, as you're kind of finding your way in that role and taking on those challenges, do you have anyone in the field that, you look up to, or was your mentor to help kind of like guide you as you, develop into the journalist that you are?
Oh, I love that question. I love talking about my heroes and my mentors, even if some of them are imaginary, like they don't know that they're my mentors. But they are, and they were. So one person I've been thinking about so much during this election year has been Gwen Ifill. She was so graceful and composed and poised and smart. I had the pleasure of meeting her at a party years after I was in newsrooms. And I just admired, she was, for those of you who don't know, Gwen Ifill was a reporter on the PBS NewsHour. One of the few Black women in journalism who had risen to that height, but also I think she had been famously been kind of derided by a former radio host who's kind of like one of these shock jocks from like the older era. And she wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about it, that he had said that she looked like a cleaning lady or something like that. And, she just had like such a fierce and dignified response to to that without actually even really, it's Don Imus. I was blanking on his name, but she, you know, without kind of going down to his level, and like doing the mudslinging thing, which has become really popular. She just said, you know, I've risen to my position because I don't let, you know, those kinds of insults, you know, stop me from being who I am, and for continuing to be committed to the job that I do. So I really took a lot from that, and just watching the way that she composed herself, and also, I mean, I think other journalists, and reporters, who are like that. You know, Ed Bradley was another person that I really admired. I went to boarding school through a program called A Better Chance, and Ed Bradley was also a Better Chance scholar. But he was also just really steady, you know, just really non-reactive. I'm going to get the story, I'm going to give you the facts kind of thing, which is, you know, easier said than done when you're on the other side of a potential attack. And another of my mentors that I'll talk about a little bit later, Dory Maynard, was the daughter of Robert Maynard, who was the first Black editor of a mainstream newspaper in the US in Oakland. And Dory was fantastic. She was the only person, my only mentor to take me to a psychic. When I was thinking about different job offers to see, you know, if they would get it right, and they did. You know, kind of lucky. But she did amazing work with the Maynard Institute for Journalism Education, which is also covered in the book that I wrote. Unfortunately, she passed before it was published, but you know, she did a lot of pioneering, amazing work, and so did the Maynard Institute, in terms of getting reporters and newsrooms and editors to think about diversity in a different way, to think about them as fault lines instead of thinking about, you know, how do we get, you know, sort of tokenized diversity. How do we kind of pepper it in here and there so that it looks like we're really diverse? She really had a wholesale approach to how you do that in journalism. But I could go on and on. There have been tons of people who've helped me, who've guided me, and given me amazing advice. And I know I've only mentioned Black people, but I would say that, you know, white men in journalism have actually been some of the most helpful allies for me. I'm thinking of Tommy Miller, who was the managing editor of the Houston Chronicle when I first got there. And Tim Kelly, who was an editor at the Beaumont Enterprise, which I hated Beaumont. And he knew it, and I just was never gonna like the place. They didn't have sidewalks, and my only entertainment was a 24-hour Walmart, so I was like kind of scarred. But he gave me amazing advice about how to negotiate salaries, and how to negotiate effectively, like not based on emotion, but based on actual hard figures. And you know, Tommy Miller, who was actually from Beaumont, and knew, you know, some amazing facts about it. It's near where Janis Joplin is from, over there in Port Arthur. You know, just was also really even-tempered, and you know, really encouraged me not to think of myself in the box that other people put me in. So being a person of color in a newsroom, or working in journalism, period, these days, you know, it doesn't matter what the context is. Not many people are in actual newsrooms. They're more in like media organizations, which I'll talk about a little bit later. You know, there's, I quoted someone in the book in 2015 saying that there's this lack of imagination for what can happen when you're a Black reporter. And so I think that having a diversity of mentors, which some people have called a board of directors, or your personal board of directors, having that diverse group of people to shape and guide me really helped me to not internalize other people's lack of imagination about what was possible for me in my career.
Amazing, thank you. It's so interesting to hear, you know, where you draw inspiration, strength, guidance, and it comes from all different places. That's great. Thank you.
Thank you. So 2020, of course, is a different year than even 2010 or 2000 when we thought the world was going to end because our computers were programmed, before before 1999. And so, it's different, of course, than perhaps any other year that's preceded it. The pandemic has sent white collar workers like myself, those who can afford to work from home, those who are largely white, middle, upper class, to remote working. It was the convergence of the pandemic, though, that added attention, I think, and action by white people, white allies, to the Black Lives Matter movement, which falls under the umbrella of the Movement for Black Lives, which is, this broader coalition of folks who are working for police reform and other, sort of racial injustice initiatives after the murder of George Floyd and Ahmaud Arbery and Breonna Taylor and others at the hands of police. And so I think that was a part of what re-energized the Black Lives Matter movement in the US and put Black protest and matters of diversity and dimensions of diversity kind of back into the press in a real way, and certainly in the most real way that I've seen during, the course of my career writing and publishing. And so I would say prior to 2020, the most recent, I think, main event for considering diversity of viewpoints came with the historic publication of the 1619 Project, the New York Times, which is sort of this ongoing interactive, but also led to magazine, but then, historians asking questions about it and on and on and on. And that'll be part of, I think, the follow-up for this workshop. That you'll get to look more closely at some aspects of the 1619 Project with each other, which I think will be great. But since we are in a diversity and journalism workshop, we do have to acknowledge kind of where newsrooms are at this moment. This is a graphic from the Columbia Journalism Review from a couple years ago. It's still fairly accurate. Newsrooms only have about 17% non-white journalists. I have to say also that this is based on the newsrooms that have responded. There are some newsrooms that won't respond to surveys like this and never have. The number is smaller when you look at newsroom leadership. These sort of gatekeeping or major decision-making positions, minorities make up about 13% of newsroom leadership. And since which is problematic, right? Because 37% of the US population is not white, and that number has probably grown since these statistics were collected, which means that essentially you don't need to be a non-white journalist in order to write accurately, obviously, about the population in which you live, but it does help to have a newsroom that reflects the diversity of the world around it. And so since the American Society of News Editors is the group that keeps track of these statistics, and since it was created in 1978, the number of journalists of color in most newsrooms has averaged around 10%. And retention is continuously stalled. I mentioned Dory Maynard earlier. She was one of the, her organization was one of the pioneers in terms of training, having sort of networking groups and committees and associations and recruiting efforts. The Hearst Newspapers Fellowship Program was one of those efforts too, in terms of recruiting minorities from sort of non-traditional backgrounds to go into newsrooms, and also to work with editors on retention and those kinds of things. But like many systems, the structure upon which traditional media is based, which is essentially this hierarchy that reinforces the authority and the centrality of a white heterosexual male perspective, it's sort of a hierarchy that's not particularly conducive to fundamental change. You know, it hasn't, these sort of incremental changes over time haven't actually led to one big change. We sort of have been going kind of in a circle. And so this is why the number of kind of diverse hires haven't changed more or less for many decades, despite our best efforts. And it's also one of the reasons why some of the other diversity dimensions that I mentioned, like geographical, gender, class diversity, are often missing from large media organizations. You know, the simplest way to put this is that people tend to hire people that they're comfortable with. You know, in I guess HR speak, you know, if you're a good fit, you know, which is basically like what I want to hang out with you at lunch, what I want to sit at your lunch table, you know, what I want to go out with you after work. And if I don't know anyone like you, the chances that I would do that are really slim, because as humans, we really don't like to get out of our comfort zones that much. But, you know, the journalism and media business model, which had been failing for years before the internet and social media accelerated its demise a little bit, was built on these old economic understandings and kind of outdated value propositions that centered the powerful, kind of ignored everyone else. But in order to really see and understand the majority of Americans, journalists in newsrooms where there are just a few non-white journalists and women and people from working class backgrounds, those who identify as non-binary, you all have to work just much harder to divest themselves of their privileges for long enough to even pretend to see non-white people without the filters of their lived experiences. So that kind of brings us to more recent events. Finally, we're not in the 60s anymore. And, you know, this has sort of been, I think, the ideas that I was just talking about are kind of at the heart of America's racial reckoning. And also, I think our individual interrogations of ourselves and how we see and allow for white supremacy to impact our lives. And, you know, remember that, you know, what I said at the beginning, part of what's most important about creating true and sustainable diversity in journalism is learning to see, and just learning to see in a different way. And I think part of 2020 has been, you know, people really learning to see in a different way. There have been many riots and uprisings and other reactions to the social conditions of Black Americans in the years since the Kerner Commission report. Some of them emerged as Black Lives Matter protests after the fatal shooting of Trayvon Martin in 2012. Others emerged in response to the fatal shooting of Michael Brown in 2014, whom the New York Times famously called No Angel, even as the story about him acknowledged that he was a teenager who had been unfairly targeted by police, his body left in the street for all to see for hours. What was different, I think, about Ferguson from a diversity and journalism perspective is it was the first time I actually can recall seeing reports from Black male reporters, like Pulitzer Prize-winning Washington Post reporter Wesley Lowery, who was actually arrested at a McDonald's. He was trying to get Wi-Fi while he's out in the field, and police, you know, ignored his press pass and arrested him. Or NPR Code Switch's Gene Demby, who's actually a friend. They each opened up about the trauma of covering police brutality leveled at Black people and how it impacted them professionally. I think Jenna Wortham at the New York Times Magazine has also written about this. So that was the first time I really remembered seeing it, you know, after at that point being in the business for more than 10 years, really seeing that level of vulnerability and feeling like it was an indication of things beginning to change, you know, that there were enough people who had this different perspective on what they were seeing and had to react to, that they could make stories reflecting that. And I think what changed in the case of Mr. Floyd's death, in particular, was the intersection of the pandemic, the attention that white people felt forced to pay attention to a problem that had long been ignored. And so it was really not just one side of this Black-white kind of dichotomy that we often talk about, especially when we're talking about diversity, but it was really this multiracial, cross-geographic coalition that changed the equation. So before I talk more about this slide, I want to say I am a fan and a longtime subscriber to the New York Times. I've been reading it daily since I was a teenager. It's my hometown newspaper, which also happens to be what the old people used to call the national paper of record. I guess it's now our international paper of record. But it has at times, and rightfully so, I think. And I think to the New York Times' credit, it has also taken, I think, accountability for this, has sometimes had a rigid attachment to the myth of objectivity. And I think the reason that's important in this context is because sometimes that gets in the way of real diversity. And when I saw this particular front page, it reminded me so much of the Kerner Commission days, the uprisings that might have prompted some more investigation and investigation of the reporters in how they saw things. So this is one of the early stories about the protests that was on the front page of the New York Times, one that I saw, one of the ones that I saw at least. And so I wondered about a couple of things, I wondered about putting absolute chaos in quotes in bold type on the front page of the newspaper, and what that said about the image. Is it meant to provoke fear? Is it meant to actually really see what's happening? Does it feel evident that the story is meant to tell us what the story is meant to tell us, right? Are we thinking about what the broader community is doing in the wake of George Floyd's death? Are we thinking about the military and the military presence? And what does that military presence say about the people in that community? And what about the words around it? Everything is about what is destroyed and what has erupted, and basically volatile language about a scenario that has some other facets to it. And finally, I thought back to that Edward Crawford photo, right? So why not a picture like that, which kind of humanizes protesters, as opposed to one that makes them kind of these sort of background participants, kind of shadowy figures. So this is looking at things like this. This is just one example. I wouldn't say that there have been a lot of them in the New York Times, which I'm happy about. But I also think that reporting puts you between a rock and a hard place, because on one hand, you do have to report what's happening, because if you don't, people are like, you're hiding the truth. But if you choose to tell a different story, there's always going to be someone who is unhappy. But now people are choosing to get their news directly from social media, increasingly subscription newsletters like Substack. You may have seen stories about that. Essentially people making individualized platforms so that they can sell their version of what they think is news. I'm not sure that I think that that's a solution either. But one response to a lack of diversity in journalism has made audiences flock to Twitter and Instagram and Facebook. I don't use TikTok, but I'm going to mention it anyway, because that's what the olds do. We just mention things that are not necessarily in our wheelhouse. Parler is also in that group, but I understand that has some other connotations and I don't know about them. So, but people are looking for the answers that they seek in all these different places. Many of you know, because of the election year and stories related to the pervasive misinformation on these platforms, that social media is not really the go-to solution for diversity either. Tons of problems with algorithms and content editors and moderators who have the same issues as some of the gatekeeping editors and publishers that we are talking about here. They suppress some voices and not others on those platforms. And so they're also very specifically platforms and not media organizations, which allows them to divest themselves of the accountability that's required in journalism, which is also problematic, right? So they can just say the people on my platform are the ones who are doing it, not me, Mark Zuckerberg, which is That's fine. You know, that's a really interesting way of talking about a place that, for example, Facebook in places like the Philippines, that is the major news source. Like, it is the only news source. So, you know, there are all these questions about the responsibility or irresponsibility of not just saying you're a media organization. But what is amazing about these platforms, though, is that they've allowed, you know, sort of the everyday person to witness, to galvanize, and connect with people all over the world. You know, when you look at somebody like Darnella Frazier, who is the 17-year-old who taped George Floyd's killing, that was watched hundreds of thousands of times around the world, and it led to a resurgence of the Black Lives Matter movement, which also started with a Facebook post in 2013. So, you know, there are good things and bad things. And then, you know, almost finally, when we're looking at dimensions of diversity, sources of digital information, I think, is one of those areas to look at. In 2015, I wrote about how almost like most trained veteran journalists were kind of starting to be considered on the same level as anybody with a really nice smartphone, who could point and shoot and take video, which is just about anybody. And it's like being the author of, I'm not this person, but like being the author of several best-selling books, only to have someone who self-publishes their journal entry with little editing go viral overnight, right? They become a sensation, and you're like, what? That's not fair. So that's kind of what's happened with digital information. But not all perspectives are equal, and not all sources are equal. And sometimes that could be good, but sometimes it can be bad. It comes with some pitfalls. So we have this abundance of information sources, but the questions that we can continue to ask ourselves include: who is telling this story? Do I believe them? What makes them an authority? Are they male? Are they non-binary? Are they Black? Are they Asian? Middle class? Working class? Wealthy? Why does that matter? Why does their class matter to this story? Is it important? Is it unimportant? Who is the story meant for? I'm always talking to my students about their audience. Whether or not we are aware as reporters, as journalists, as writers, students, about who we're writing towards or who we're recording towards, we do have an audience in mind. And so the more transparent you can be with yourself about that as a content producer, the more clear it will be in your actual story. And I think that actually the better job you'll do about making sure that you have whatever you consider to be diverse covered in that story. But then as a consumer of news, you know, is this meant for me, or was this meant for someone else? I think it's important in terms of civic participation to be, I've become that lady who writes letters to the editor. It's super fun. But I mean, I think also, you know, to have the journalism that you believe that you deserve, and that you most want to see in the world, you know, you should be an advocate for the perspectives that you don't see. And so how will you know unless you reach out and say, hey, I noticed that this wasn't covered, or I would have liked to see this. I think those are the most fascinating parts of the paper for me, and of news stories online, is to look at the comments. But also to always be asking yourself, who am I writing toward? Who am I trying to talk to? Who am I trying to reach? And what do I see? You know, is probably the most important question. What's in the way of what I would like to see, but I can't? And how do I remove it? You know, how do I get it out of my way? So that's what I have for you as we wrap up. And I'm happy to take any additional questions.
Thank you. That was amazing. And I love ending on that note, you know, kind of recognizing the different sources of news and kind of arming yourself with the tools to make sure that you're processing them the right way and in an honest way, in a clear way, so that you know what you're getting and in what context it's coming. And it's super important. And I think especially for a lot of the younger students who are used to just getting their news on social media, and it's often the only way they get their news, so it's important. I had a couple of questions for you, if you don't mind, but
No.
I was curious to, like, you started off talking about how you didn't necessarily realize that this career path in this lane was initially like available to you. And I'm curious if you had sort of an aha moment where you're like, wow, I can do this. This can be like my career, my life path. Or was it more so, chipping away and carving out that path, and then, maybe you look behind you and you're like, wow, I've come very far. Was it one or the other, or a combination of both?
Yeah, I love that question. You ask good questions, all of you, and you too, Sarah. So I would say this is actually kind of connected to the mentor question, but I'm going to try to keep it shorter than the mentor answer, because I feel like I got really excited and I went all over the place, like dug into the annals of history in my brain. So I was a junior in college. I went to Vassar in Poughkeepsie, and one of the sort of independent studies that I did was working as a volunteer in the pre-release program at Greenhaven Prison, which was maybe about an hour from a campus. And what I learned being a part of that project was that I had more in common with some of the prisoners at Greenhaven Prison than I did with a lot of my classmates. I had classmates who were like related to famous people and really very, very rich. And I was very not rich. I was homeless for part of my time at Vassar. So I felt like, wow, what an interesting experience, right? To be in a place where, now, of course, everyone talks about things like imposter syndrome and these other aspects of being, just a minority or a marginalized person in a majority group. But I didn't really have language for it then. And so I wrote this piece I was writing, because I was also a nerd. I was writing for the school newspaper, the Miscellany News, and I wrote about that experience, what it was like to every week go be with Black and Latino men from the Bronx and Brooklyn. They had accents, they sounded like home to me. To go be with them and hear their experience and kind of tell them what the world was looking like, in the late 90s, that they were about to re-enter. And then I would go back to campus and I would hear people talk about, spring break in Milan and, other just, other amazing things, their vacation house. It's like, oh, cool. You have multiple houses. What's that like? So, I wrote about that disparity, and it was posted in the print version of the Miscellany News, but it also went over something called the College Wire. And at that time, a foundation saw the story, reached out to me and asked me to start writing for their website. And so when I was a junior in college, I started writing for money about my perspective. And I was like, oh, people pay you to write things. I was an English major and I was like writing short stories. So it had not occurred to me that there could be a profession that also blended writing and like an actual viable career. So that was kind of how it occurred to me, is that I had written that story. And then I began to write these other stories that were essentially personal essays, back when personal essays were like things that people like really promoted and published a lot on the internet. And so I just happened to do that. And I met an alum, a Vassar alum who worked at the Albany Times Union, a little bit further upstate New York. And she then mentioned, because Albany Times Union is part of the Hearst chain, she knew an editor who knew about the just started Hearst newspaper's fellowship program. And so she asked me, do you have clips? I guess people don't even talk about clips anymore, because who clips things out of newspapers? But I was like, clips, I have clips. And like, it was just all the random stuff that I had written for the Miscellany News. but that was my start. And, you know, it turned out to be enough to get my foot in the door, which was incredible. So it's a combination of writing a lot already and then, you know, kind of luck and opportunity and meeting the right people.
It's amazing. What a story. Thank you so much for sharing so much, not only about your work and your perspective on journalism, but about yourself as well. It's so fun to hear and amazing to hear, you know, the life you've created. It's impressive.
Thank you so much.
So I want to know, before we wrap up, I want to know if there's any other thoughts or pieces or takeaways that you want to leave us with, or anything, especially for the students on the call, that you want them to come away with or keep with them after this session.
You know, I think that I would have gone much more confidently into newsrooms and writing about my personal experience if I understood how valuable it is to know that you're not the only one, right? Like, whatever your experience is, like, there's someone else who's having your experience. They just, for whatever reason, haven't written about it. And there's such an amazing kind of alchemy that happens within you and then around you when you can begin to connect your story to other people's stories, right? Like, there's tons of reasons to feel like I'm so different from that person. We're so different, like we can't possibly have the same things in common. But there are these universal experiences that so many of us have, I think, especially even, you know, in a year like this. There's so many common forces that I think draw us together and make our stories so connected to each other. So it takes a long time to feel confident enough that what you have to offer is something that the world needs. I wish I had heard it more when I was younger, that even if I think it's not, no one's gonna read it, nobody really cares, you just have to kick that inner critic out of your head more often. You don't have to break up with them. You don't have to like completely, you know, kidnap them, put them away forever, but you can put them away for like an hour, you know, like if you feel like, okay, there's just this like really annoying, persistent voice in my head that tells me to stop, just see what you can do to get rid of it for 30 minutes and then 45 minutes and then an hour. And it's incredible how much that frees you up to just write whatever it is that you need to write.
Amazing. I love that. I think that's perfect advice to end on. And I appreciate you and sharing everything and your thoughts. It's been really fun, very informative, and we've really enjoyed it a lot. So thank you so much. And I'll ask Darby if you have anything to add before we wrap up as well.
Yeah, Hoshonda, I mean, wise words, and thank you so much for spending time with us. We're grateful to you and to the School of the New York Times to enable us to get to you. So thank you so much. We appreciate it. And all the best. Thank everybody at home and all the teachers and students and staff. So everybody have a wonderful day. Hoshonda, thank you again.
Thank you so much.